March 17, 1943, Berlin. General Alfred Jodl laughed as he heard the figures. A bomber every 63 minutes? Impossible. The Americans, he said, knew how to build refrigerators, not airplanes. On that frigid morning, the leadership of the Third Reich firmly believed that US industry was slow, disorganized, and morally weak, the product of a mixed society, a lax democracy, and an economy driven by propaganda. That laughter, however, was about to be swallowed up by a statistic. On the other side of the Atlantic, Ford Motor Company had converted its automobile assembly line into an aerial destruction plant, where machines with 1.5 million parts gained wings every hour. It was not a metaphor, it was mathematics. And this was precisely what the Germans could not accept. This documentary reconstructs step by step the biggest intelligence failure of World War II. A mistake that was not born from a lack of data, but from the refusal to believe in reality. German spies saw the truth. The Nazi leaders chose the illusion. What began as ideological contempt ended in absolute silence on the ruins of Berlin. But before we dive into the documents, names, and operations, there's one statistic that defines the absurdity of this story. In 1944, as Germany struggled to maintain its aerial production lines with scarce steel and oil, a single American factory, Willow Run, delivered a full bomber every 63 minutes. No tanks, no parts. But an 18-ton aircraft with 1.5 million components, 4 engines and 2 bomb bays, operated by more than 42,000 civilians, many of them women and black workers, this assembly line looked more like a propaganda myth in the eyes of Berlin. But the spies knew it was real and it was unstoppable. If you value the preservation of these facts and believe that historical truth needs to be told accurately, please support this work with a like and subscribe. Its action helps to keep the memory alive and to dismantle piece by piece the illusions of the past. By 1941, German intelligence was already beginning to realize that something was going on in American industry. General Karl Köhler, commander of the Luftwaffe, wrote a confidential report to Hermann Göring, the all-powerful Reichsmarshal, warning of an alarming development in the United States. American factories were producing about 2,000 planes a month, and Abwehr spies had collected data from a variety of sources, including military attachés and diplomats. Göring's response, however, was one of utter contempt. He simply laughed. "They know how to make refrigerators, not airplanes," he said, completely ignoring the magnitude of what was being reported. For him, the idea that a democratic nation could transform itself into a military power of this scale was absurd. The concept of an America capable of mass production and efficiency never fit the ideological parameters of the Reich. Göring's arrogance, while immensely damaging, was not an anomaly. It was the common view within the Nazi regime, fueled by the conviction that Germany, with its racial supremacy and culture of military efficiency, was on a completely higher level. The Germans, from the perspective of their racial doctrine, saw Americans as mestizos, their factories disorganized, and their diverse labor force, with blacks, women, and immigrants, as a weakness. For the Nazis, this made it impossible for the United States to match Germany's industrial empire, or even worse, surpass it. This underestimation was embedded in their worldview, the belief that a democracy with so many flaws could not produce extraordinary results was a fallacy that would be costly. The first major failure of German intelligence was not a lack of data, but a lack of willingness to correctly interpret that data. Köhler's information was clear, but the cultural and ideological assumptions were so deeply ingrained that the Nazi regime was unable to look at the numbers and understand what they meant. While the Americans were building an unbeatable war machine, the Germans remained stuck with the idea that they could win with the power of superior technique and a racially pure workforce. This blinded them to what was really happening in Washington, Detroit, and other industrial centers. Aircraft manufacturing in the United States has followed a breakneck pace. The Ford Motor Company, which had excelled in car production, now found itself transformed into a factory of mass destruction. The Willow Run assembly line, which produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, was the pinnacle of this transformation. When General Köhler sent his report, the Americans weren't just building airplanes. They were organizing a colossal logistical operation where thousands of parts and workers were precisely aligned to manufacture war machines at unprecedented speed. It was impossible for Göring and his subordinates to grasp the scope of this. To them, The American production was a marketing gimmick. The idea that the Americans could surpass Germany in terms of industrial capacity seemed as implausible as the idea of democracy itself. They couldn't see what was happening before their eyes. America was building a war infrastructure that would ultimately surpass that of any nation, including Germany. And worst of all, they refused to believe it. It could be said that German intelligence failures began there, with this unfounded disregard for American industrial capacity. It was not a lack of reporting or data, but an inability to accept that a nation built on democratic principles could have such efficiency, especially when compared to a regime that prided itself on its technical perfection and its racist leadership. In fact, the Nazis were so convinced of their superiority that they failed to see the true power of the United States, an industry that, rather than being disorganized, was incredibly well coordinated, capable of rounding up thousands of workers and turning a car assembly line into a heavy bomber factory. What was really at stake was the battle of mass production versus high-quality artisanal production. Germany prided itself on its technical precision, its focus on excellence, and the improvement of its war machines. However, the pace of US production proved that the ability to do more on a larger scale would be the real key to victory. A simple piece of data shows how much the Germans ignored this concept. American production of B-24 bombers in 1943 was 10 times greater than Germany's during the same period. While the Germans struggled to maintain their aircraft production, the Americans were flooding the skies with an overwhelming amount of planes. Shocking data, isn't it? If you were also surprised by this statistic, leave your comment below with something like logistics wins or absolute power. Your opinion helps to spread that story and support historical research. And that wasn't the only irony. American production not only outnumbered, but also in efficiency. Every part was manufactured with precision, and workers who had previously been seen as unfit for such tasks by the Nazis were now manufacturing the most complex of war machines. Men, women, blacks, immigrants, all working together to build the infrastructure that would defeat the Nazi war machine. By January 1943, American factories were producing 1 to 400 B-24s per month, while Germany was able to produce 200 aircraft in total, adding planes of different types and capacities. While Germany focused on making sophisticated and high-cost weapons, the United States was using its mass production capacity to produce an unbeatable amount of aircraft. It was no longer a question of technical superiority, but of a war of attrition, and, crucially, the Nazis still refused to accept that the United States had found the right path. As the year 1943 progressed, American bomber production held steady month after month, while German production began to fall due to a lack of resources and increasing pressure from Allied bombing. Meanwhile, the Willow Run assembly line was running at full throttle, and the Reich was beginning to realize too late that what the Americans were doing was not a propaganda trick. It was real. This escalation of production not only showed the power of American industry, but also revealed Germany's fatal flaw, an inability to adapt to the new reality of war, which no longer depended on brute force, but on the ability to do more, faster, and cheaper. But what happened when German spies began to realize the magnitude of this production? How did reality begin to seep in, even into those who were responsible for gathering information? The next part will reveal the final attempts of the Abwehr to try to convince Berlin that the numbers could not be ignored, and the final response of the Nazi leaders. Willow Run in 1943 was still a mystery in the shadows of German espionage. In the minds of Nazi commanders, the idea that Ford, a giant of the American auto industry, was creating a factory capable of producing heavy bombers at a rate never before imagined seemed absurd. However, as German spies began to piece together the fragments, what seemed like a rumor became a reality impossible to ignore. The Detroit plant, described by some as a secret project, was becoming the focal point of an information war. And the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, didn't know what to do with it. The first information began to arrive from unexpected sources. Spanish diplomats, Swedish businessmen, and even letters from American workers began to give details about the Willow Run factory. Many were surprised at how quickly the operations were being carried out. What once seemed like a one-off effort, focused solely on vehicle production, was now expanding into hitherto uncharted territory, the mass production of combat aircraft. Intercepted reports indicated that instead of just making automobiles, Ford was using its facilities to assemble B-24 bombers, complex aircraft with more than 1.5 million parts. These early reports shocked German intelligence. The idea that the United States, a democratic nation with an economic and social model so different from the authoritarian Nazi regime, was doing so well in industrial production seemed unrealistic. For the Germans, mass production was not a feature of an open and democratic society, but something that was associated with centralized and controlled regimes. How could an imperfect democracy be so efficient in making war machines? The idea simply did not fit the Nazis' worldview. Early attempts to understand the real extent of Willow Run were thwarted. Abwehr spies such as Georg Nicholas were at the forefront of this search, trying to gather information through networks of contacts in Latin America and Europe. However, what they found was a riddle. They heard about a monstrous factory in Detroit, but what they were seeing in the reports didn't make sense. How could Ford, a company known for its cars, be assembling planes on a production line as efficiently as its car factories? The initial Abwehr documentation only reinforced the idea that the American effort was propaganda, an exaggerated version of reality, as the spies themselves suspected. They believed that the US government was simply spreading disinformation to intimidate its enemies. After all, German industry had already demonstrated superior technical ability, creating precision weapons that had broken European defenses. Still, the mystery grew. Every new report, every letter from workers that arrived through spy channels reinforced a truth that was inconvenient for the Nazis. One bomber every 63 minutes, an industrial plant with 3.5 million square feet, more than 42,000 workers and logistics that seemed to defy the very definition of mass production. The idea that this assembly line could be real and operating for more than a year was beginning to enter the secret archives of the Abwehr with a note of incredulity and fear. No German factory had even imagined producing airplanes with this frequency. Even Detroit's auto industry seemed to be pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible. For German leaders, the information didn't make sense, but the numbers kept coming in. One of the biggest obstacles for the Abwehr was the resistance of the Reich top leadership to believe the reports. Officially, German intelligence did not want to give credence to what seemed like a propaganda attempt, a trick of American psychological warfare. In addition, there was a dominant theory that the United States was very far from being a direct threat to Germany in terms of industrial production capacity. However, what the spies were beginning to realize was a disconcerting reality. The production capacity of the United States not only competed with that of Germany, but surpassed it. While Germany was investing in expensive and technological production systems, the United States was mobilizing human and material resources on a completely different scale. The words of Georg Nicholas, head of the intelligence network in Mexico City, summed up the general skepticism in Berlin well. If these figures are correct, then Germany has already lost the war. Those words, delivered in a tone that mixed incredulity with mild despair, captured the essence of the economic war being waged behind the scenes. American industrial capabilities were far from being understood and fully assessed. American factories weren't just efficient, they were huge, militarily organized, and most important, fast. By the time German spies began to understand the magnitude of Willow Run's output, the damage was done. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the Willow Run factory became more and more real. Abwehr spies, who initially saw the information as mere rumors or exaggerations, began to gather crucial details: the size of the factory, the number of workers, and the growing production of airplanes. Even with the vague images, such as sketches or workers' accounts, what was being produced seemed challenging, not only to German assumptions, but to the entire industrial logic of the time. This was beginning to become a nightmare that Germany was not prepared to face. The response of the Nazi regime led by Hermann Göring was one of absolute denial. Instead of accepting that the United States was producing planes in large quantities and efficiently, Göring continued to scoff at the idea. For him, the numbers and reports were wrong, unrealistic or fabricated, as part of an American psychological campaign to spread panic. He believed that in war, the quality of weapons outweighed quantity, and that the United States, with its mixed workforce, could never match the precision of German industries. The mystery of Willow Run, however, was about to be confirmed. Abwehr spy Oberleutnant Ritter, a former pilot who had lived in America and understood the country's industrial mentality well, was beginning to understand that what was happening at Ford was not just propaganda, but a war effort of immense proportions. He knew that American production capacity could change the course of the war, but it was clear that Berlin had not yet internalized this reality. What happened next? What more concrete evidence was gathered, and how did Nazi leaders react when confronted with irrefutable evidence? The answer would come from a crucial meeting where German military intelligence would finally be forced to face the truth and the lie. In February 1943, Mexico City was the scene of a seemingly innocent encounter, but one that would change the course of the war. Harold Morrison, a Ford executive, was at a dinner with German businessmen and diplomats, a communal social gathering over a few shots of tequila and relaxed conversation. However, what seemed to be a casual, alcohol-fueled conversation would turn into one of the greatest revelations of World War II espionage. Unaware that his caller was working for the Abwehr, Morrison began to describe in detail what he had just seen at one of Ford's facilities, Willow Run. The factory, which up to that point had seemed a myth in the eyes of many German spies and officers, was being described vividly and technically by Morrison. He was talking about the huge assembly line, the almost military organization of operations, and the conditions inside the factory, where the internal climate was controlled to ensure efficiency. Even artificial rainfall happened due to the humidity required for aluminum production. He described the precision of the female workers, many of them black women, who deftly operated precision drills, assembling parts of the bombers with impressive coordination. But what really caught the attention of those present was Morrison's simple, almost casual statement. Every hour a B-24 bomber leaves there. The reaction of German businessmen was mixed. Some were incredulous, others fascinated. They could not believe that the Americans were producing with such efficiency, but what was being said seemed increasingly impossible to ignore. Morrison, when questioned, took a napkin and, with the tip of a pencil, quickly sketched a drawing of how the assembly line was organized. The outline was simple, but detailed enough to illustrate the impressive organization and pace of American production. Unknowingly, he was creating one of the most valuable documents for German intelligence, an improvised drawing that would later be used as proof that the numbers being reported by the spies were, in fact, accurate. This information, revealed in a relaxed moment and without the slightest perception of gravity, would cross the Atlantic and reach the officers of the Abwehr. What seemed impossible to believe was now confirmed in detail. But even so, the Germans had the words. They had the information, but they couldn't or didn't want to believe it. Skepticism still dominated Berlin. What seemed like propaganda or an exaggeration of American capability was now increasingly proving to be an intransigent reality. Willow Run, the famous miracle factory, was not an invention but a real war machine in operation, producing at an incomprehensible rate. As much as the data piled up and the evidence became impossible to ignore, Nazi leaders, including Hermann Göring, continued to refuse any attempt to believe in the magnitude of American industrial production. The assembly line that produced a bomber every 63 minutes was seen by them as an impossible exception, a phenomenon that did not fit their worldview. They believed that American democracy, with its plural system and its racial diversity, could not be effective in a war industry. For the Nazis, a nation like the United States, with its open system and its internal problems, simply did not have the ability to be competitive with the immense apparatus of production controlled by Germany's totalitarian regime. But while contempt and incredulity continued to dominate Berlin, the numbers did not lie. The American government was creating a war industry on a monumental scale, where an assembly line, more like a military power plant, was able to produce airplanes accurately, quickly, and most importantly, in large quantities. The Germans' misunderstanding was not only about American machines and technique, but also about the spirit of work that united women, men, blacks, whites, and immigrants. For the US war machine, everyone had a key role to play, and it was this mobilization of human talent and resources that would become one of the greatest forces in the war. The revelation that was slowly spreading through German intelligence was not only about the strength of American production, but about how a democratic system, with all its defects and divisions, was able to gather resources unbeatably. Germany, with all its concentration of power and efficiency, was being overtaken by the diversity and coordinated work of a nation with an industrial capacity it had never imagined possible. Harold Morrison's words, spoken at an informal dinner, began to resonate in Berlin as an overwhelming and unrelenting truth. That moment, however, was not the end of the story. While the Abwehr began to understand the magnitude of American production, the scenario was about to change even more. The German government had devastating information in its hands. The question was, what to do with it? How to act in the face of the reality that the spies were bringing you? Berlin's response would not be immediate, but rather marked by a reaction of despair. And when the truth finally arrived, it was met with such a degree of resistance that the German war machine would never be the same. But what happened at the most important meeting in the history of espionage? How were the concrete data confronted with ideological stubbornness? The answer, when it finally arrived, showed how much arrogance could blind even the most powerful. The shock that followed the revelation of the American production was not only strategic, but existential. What the spies had seen, and the numbers showed, would be a lesson that Germany would only learn too late. Charles Sorensen, Ford's head of production, was a man of few outbursts, but with a ruthless and innovative mind. In 1941, he implemented a method that would transform the American arms industry, the assembly line adapted to the production of heavy bombers. Willow Run, the Detroit plant that Sorensen oversaw, was not just a production site, but an industrial revolution masquerading as normalcy. He wasn't just creating airplanes, it was turning the war into a perfectly orchestrated machine, where every movement and every piece was connected in a continuous, precise flow. This system, which to Nazi eyes seemed like fiction, was simply the product of an unbeatable logic, mass production adapted to the battlefield. Sorensen was a master in the use of repetition. He knew that the strength of production was not only in the number of workers, but in the way each task was subdivided and standardized. Each worker on the assembly line had a specific function, simple and repetitive, but vital to the assembly sequence. At first, this approach seemed like a waste of resources, as the idea of dividing a simple task into several smaller parts did not fit the traditional view of military production. However, for Sorensen, this division and specialization of tasks resulted in unparalleled efficiency. It was not the individual skill of the worker that mattered, but his ability to perform a task repeated with pinpoint precision day after day, until the operation was part of his quasi-automatic motion. Instead of building airplanes in an open space, where hundreds of workers huddled around a single bomber, as was done in most factories at the time, Sorensen implemented a system that turned aircraft into moving parts. The fuselage, wings, engines, and tail were assembled separately, and then joined along a moving assembly line, just like a car at the Ford plant. The principle was simple. Instead of making the worker go to the piece went to the worker. This accelerated the pace of production in an unimaginable way. Sorensen wasn't just creating airplanes, he was creating a new kind of warfare. And this method of production, which to Nazi leaders seemed like a marketing gimmick, proved unbeatable. The American secret was not in the military strength or the mystical technique that the Reich believed was necessary to win. It was, rather, in the brutal simplicity of repetition and in the precise rhythm of production. Each worker knew exactly what he had to do, and the operation as a whole worked like a well-oiled cog. The work on Willow Run wasn't just efficient, it was exact and immense. The numbers were clear. An 18-ton B-24 aircraft, with 1.5 million parts, was produced every 63 minutes. By 1943, the factory was operating at full capacity, with continuous shifts and an army of 42,000 workers, including women, blacks, and immigrants, many of whom, if they were Europeans, would be considered inferior by Nazi ideology. What to the Nazis seemed like a major failure of the system, a mistake of democracy, proved to be one of the greatest assets of the war. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the Germans were trying to understand how this production was possible. The Abwehr was beginning to recognize that the reports about Willow Run were real, but to them, this continued to sound like a great exaggeration. How could such a young country, with such a diverse society, with its mixed workforce, produce with such speed and precision? Germany's factories, highly technified and controlled, could not catch up with American mass production. Even with their refined technique and their high-precision weapons, the Germans were struggling to keep their aircraft production at its peak. German factories were not equipped to handle the scale and efficiency of the Americans. But the problem wasn't just with the machines, it was with the method. What the Nazis did not understand was the simple power of standardization. By breaking down operations into painstaking, repetitive steps, Sorensen created a model that allowed even workers with little experience in the aerospace industry to operate efficiently and produce complex fighter planes. Task specialization not only sped up production, but also drastically reduced errors. The technical skill that the Germans valued so much in their factories did not have the same relevance. The American model, simpler but with an organizational precision, was producing at a pace that surpassed anything any nation had been able to achieve up to that point. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, all along. The ability of a dysfunctional democracy to create such a precise and effective industrial system was being underestimated from the start. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so that we can bring you more detailed content about this story and many others. At the same time that German spies began to piece together this industrial puzzle, another revelation was approaching. How could the Nazis, with all their advanced resources and techniques, continue to underestimate the real threat? Would the combination of mass production and exceeding human expectations lead the United States to victory, while Germany sank into a fatal miscalculation? For Berlin's leaders, acknowledging this reality would be a matter of life and death, and as the data piled up, the resistance to accepting what seemed impossible was about to be broken in a way they would never have imagined. But what would happen when the numbers were finally in front of them? Irrefutable. The answer was about to be given, and it would change the course of the war forever. As the year 1943 progressed, German intelligence began to gather irrefutable data on American production. Spies and reliable sources from neutral countries began to send detailed reports, and these documents were analyzed by a growing network of Abwehr agents and officers. The Germans now had concrete and multiple evidence that industrial production in the United States was not an exaggeration, but a staggering and frightening reality. The sources were varied and covered 17 countries: Swedish, Japanese, Mexican, Spanish, and Swiss, all bearing consistent reports that American production capacity was surpassing anything the Germans had predicted or imagined. What started as a rumor and then a series of doubts was now being confirmed by various parts of the world. The data was piling up. By 1943, Ford was producing not only airplanes, but also engines, precision parts, and other essential components for the American war machine. It was impossible to ignore. Willow Run's factory, which had begun with a sketch on a napkin, was now at the center of an industrial war that the Nazis could barely comprehend. To them, American production was a gimmick, a propaganda attempt, or an invention of Allied intelligence. But as the information piled up, it began to become irrefutable. Bomber production was not only happening, but it was exceeding any expectations. In one of the most impactful reports, German spies were given an aerial photograph of the Willow Run parking lot, taken by a Spanish diplomat who was in Detroit. The picture was clear. The parking lot was filled with approximately 12,000 cars, indicating that the factory was running at full steam, with at least 3 work shifts. This simple photograph, when analyzed, was a powerful confirmation of the United States' production capacity. The fact that a civilian factory was running with such a large number of workers, working in continuous shifts without stopping, was a sign of an industrial operation on a scale never seen before. Every day, the production of fighter planes was becoming a reality, not only for spies, but also for German technicians who, with their own skills, already knew how to calculate the numbers. However, there was a crucial flaw. The interpretation of this data was still blocked by the ideological blindness that dominated the Reich High Command. The Abwehr, however, was beginning to understand. With each report and each confirmation from outside sources, the truth of American production began to take shape. The Germans were gathering enough information to confirm that America's industrial capability was not an exaggerated claim or a propaganda strategy. The numbers didn't lie. But even in the face of all this evidence, the top leadership of the German government continued to hesitate, to refuse the data, to see the information as distorted or false, preferring to believe in their own perceptions rather than in a reality that is difficult to swallow. For the Nazis, the American mass production machine did not fit their understanding of how industrial warfare should work. Democracies were disorganized, unprepared, and incapable of creating efficient war machines, they thought. This ideological worldview prevented Reich leaders from accepting the truth, and it was here that the resistance of the German leadership began to make a difference. Instead of dealing with information in a rational way, data has come to be seen as a threat. Germany's pride was at stake. To admit that the United States was producing more and better than Germany meant to admit a fundamental strategic failure. This was not an intelligence-gathering failure. It was an ideological failure. The war was being defined not only by military superiority, but by the ability to mass-produce. And Americans were going faster, producing more, with a diverse workforce that the Nazis had never considered capable of such efficiency. As the reports came in and the numbers piled up, the truth of Willow Run was becoming impossible to ignore. The tipping point for the Abwehr had already occurred. The evidence was there, clear and unambiguous. American production was greater than the capacity of any belligerent nation, but the obstacle, as always, was at the top, in the Nazi leadership, which could not shake off its ideological prejudice. Goering's reaction in particular was the most obvious. He had already rejected the information when the issue first came up, and now, with all the evidence against him, he refused to acknowledge the industrial power of the United States. Even when confronted with numbers and evidence, he preferred to maintain his view that the Reich was superior. This led to a tense situation in the Abwehr. They had the information, but there was a risk in reporting that truth directly to superiors. Spies were beginning to realize that this refusal to accept the facts not only jeopardized the future of the war, but also put their own lives at risk. Revealing the truth to Berlin without political acceptance could be considered an act of treason. The spies who knew of the real American situation were now torn between their loyalty to the truth and their fear of the consequences. For those who believed that the war could be won with production and strategy, resistance to this data represented an ongoing tragedy. How could a refusal to accept reality affect the fate of a nation? But the truth could not be contained forever. As the months passed, US production was not only exceeding expectations, but it was beginning to reach numbers that Germany could never have imagined achieving. And soon this would become visible in a way that no ideological prejudice would be able to deny. The question now was, how long could Berlin continue to deceive itself? The answer was about to arrive in a way that could no longer be ignored. What would happen when American production capacity finally collided with German military strategy? When statistics become more than simple numbers, but real weapons in the skies of Europe? The truth was about to be confronted in a definitive way, and the results would be devastating. George Dash was a divided man. Born in Germany but having lived for many years in the United States, he knew he was at the center of something bigger than a simple espionage mission. In 1942, he returned to Germany after 2 years of life in the US and was recruited by the Nazis to participate in the most audacious sabotage operation the Abwehr had ever planned, inserting spies into the United States to sabotage American industrial production. He and 3 other agents were transported by submarine to the American coast, where, under orders, they were to destroy munitions factories and other strategic points. However, instead of fulfilling his mission, Dash had an epiphany. He was beginning to realize the true strength of American industry and how the information he possessed could be more valuable to information warfare than any physical sabotage. As soon as he arrived in America, Dash began to realize something that Abwehr officials had not anticipated. The power of American production was beyond mere propaganda rhetoric. He saw with his own eyes the gigantic factories that were operating at full speed. More specifically, he saw Willow Run. The factory that produced B-24 Liberator bombers every 63 minutes was not a myth. It was not a piece of propaganda. It was the backbone of an industrial war. The pace, the precision, the scale of American production was like nothing he had ever imagined, not even after years of observing German war machinery. The truth was clear, but Dash knew he was in a risky position. If he carried out sabotage, he would only be contributing to the war effort that could destroy the democracy that he was now beginning to understand more clearly. The American production system was not only unbeatable, it was an unstoppable force. Faced with this discovery, Dash made a radical decision. He would turn his mission over to the FBI. He knew that by doing so, he would be putting his own life at risk, but he was also determined to reveal the truth that Berlin refused to accept. During questioning, an FBI agent asked him about the details of the operation and what had led him to switch sides. With a sigh, Dash said, "Canaris himself told me that Hitler doesn't believe in numbers." The words remained in the air like a bomb about to explode. Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, knew of American production, But he also knew that Hitler's leadership refused to believe it. The fact that the head of the Abwehr himself had acknowledged the veracity of the figures, but that these figures had been completely ignored by the Nazi leadership, revealed an untenable fissure at the heart of the German war machine. The reaction of Americans upon hearing this confession was one of complete shock. They could not believe that German intelligence had access to such detailed and accurate information about US industrial production, and yet Nazi leaders were rejecting this data. The Willow Run plant, the backbone of US airplane production, was operating at a pace that seemed to defy any industrial logic. And even in the face of this reality, Hitler and his subordinates continued to ignore the magnitude of the threat. For the leaders of the Third Reich, this did not fit the narrative of their superiority, and the very idea that American democracy could be so efficient was inconceivable. How could women, blacks, and immigrants, these inferior groups to Nazi ideology, be able to produce on such a scale? For the Nazis, the American workforce was beyond their comprehension and therefore was relegated to the realm of the impossible. The moral shock that Dash caused by revealing the truth was profound. The fact that he, a spy infiltrated into the heart of the enemy, had turned against his own mission showed how much the logic of modern warfare was being subverted by ideology. He had been trained to destroy American production, but instead, he was revealing to the nation that he had sworn to destroy the massive flaw of his own leadership. The decisions of Hitler and his generals were based on a distorted understanding of reality. They refused to believe that America was not only building airplanes en masse, but that it was doing so with a technical and logistical method that turned factories into an unbeatable war machine. But Dach's revelation wasn't just about the numbers or about mass production. It also exposed the fundamental flaw of the Nazi leadership, the inability to adapt its strategies to the new reality of industrial warfare. Hitler and his commanders were so intoxicated by the ideology of racial supremacy and technical superiority that they could not see the simple fact that modern warfare was not just a struggle of machines and guns, but also a struggle of production. Whoever could produce more, faster, and more efficiently would dominate the battlefield, and the United States, with its methods of mass production, was approaching that dominance. As the Nazis continued to cling to their distorted view of the world, the truth was being thrown in their faces, and American factories were shaping the future of war. Dach's words echoed with a poignant irony. The numbers were there, clear and irrefutable. But at the same time, the political and ideological system that governed Germany was not able to accept them. American industrial production, logistical capacity, the combination of human and material resources were at the heart of US military power, and this reality was an existential threat to the Third Reich. The story of George Dash and his decision to turn his mission over to the FBI was not just a story of betrayal. It was the story of a failure of understanding so profound that Berlin's leaders were doomed to pay a heavy price for their blindness. The war would not be won with more powerful tanks or faster planes alone. It would be defeated by the ability to maintain a constant and growing production of war resources. And while the Nazis refused to see this, the United States was making the most of this advantage, without Berlin knowing how to act against it. But the real question was it too late for the Nazis to recognize their strategic failure? How would American production begin to directly influence the battlefields, and how would data that had been ignored turn into a devastating reality for the Reich? The answer was about to reveal itself in a deeper and more impactful way. On April 20, 1943, Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, went to Hermann Göring's residence, situated in Karin Hall, a vast estate that lay north of Berlin. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks. It was the meeting where the irrefutable evidence of American industrial production would finally be presented to the Reichsmarschall. Canaris was determined to convince Göring that the numbers could no longer be ignored, that the United States was producing bombers on a scale unattainable by Germany. But the meeting, which should have been a turning point, would soon turn into a clash of realities. Carefully, Canaris spread out on the huge oak table the detailed reports that had been collected over the past few months: communications intercepts, aerial photographs of Willow Run, testimony from diplomats and spies. Most striking of all was a photograph of the factory parking lot in Detroit, where hundreds of trucks and cars were parked, indicating the immense number of workers and the continuous pace of production. The images were clear, the data irrefutable. American production was beating the most optimistic forecasts, with Ford producing a bomber every 63 minutes. The American war machine was in full swing, and the numbers could no longer be disproved. However, when Göring saw the documents, his reaction was immediate and dismissive. He glanced quickly at the papers and let out a bitter laugh. "Wooden models, props, all of these are propaganda tricks," he said with a sardonic smile. He wasn't just discrediting the data, he was attacking the very concept of American production. For Göring, this was nothing more than a fiction, an invention that aimed to create an image of strength that did not exist. The logic behind their reaction was simple. How could a democratic nation, with such a diverse and imperfect population, be able to produce with such efficiency? He had rejected this idea from the start, and now, in the face of the evidence, he still clung to his distorted view of industrial warfare. This historical scene was not only a misinterpretation of the facts, it was the culmination of the ideological blindness that characterized the Nazi leadership. Göring, who was supposed to be in charge of Germany's air strategy, was so caught up in his faith in his own worldview that he couldn't see the truth in front of him. He refused the numbers, he refused the images, he even refused aluminum, the fundamental resource for the construction of American aircraft. He refused to accept what seemed to be the simplest truth. The United States was producing aircraft in a quantity that, in a short time, would surpass the production capacity of all of Germany. The irony of all this could not be more evident. Göring was faced with an unquestionable fact, but he chose to ignore it, preferring to live in a reality constructed by ideology. What Canaris was trying to show him was not just the military power of the United States, but a new form of warfare. Mass industrial production, the ability to mobilize human and material resources, was shaping warfare in ways the Nazis could not even imagine. Military strength came not only from the quality of weapons, but from the ability to produce these weapons in large quantities, and the United States was doing it unbeatably. But despite Göring's contempt, the evidence continued to pile up. The following month, German intelligence would receive further confirmation that American production was not just an illusion. More photographs, more reports, more data on the pace of production, and finally a confidential report from the head of air intelligence himself, General Werner Kreiper, confirmed that by 1943 Ford was producing more bombers than the entire German aircraft industry could manufacture combined. The number was alarming. The United States was producing more bombers than Germany in the entire war. But even so, Göring insisted that the numbers were false. He could not or would not accept that the United States was outmaneuvering Germany not with state-of-the-art tanks or planes, but with the sheer force of mass production. This moment of rejection and disdain was not just a failure of leadership. It was a systemic failure within the Nazi regime, which could not adapt to a war in which production capacity and logistics became as important as the weapons themselves. For the Nazis, war was a fight of quality against quantity, and they believed that their war machines with precision and sophistication were invincible. But in reality, modern warfare was being decided by one factor they could not control: the speed and quantity with which war machines were produced. The irony of this story is that while Nazi leaders ignored the data, American airplane production was becoming a real military force, with the ability to saturate the skies of Europe. And as the war intensified, American production numbers continued to grow. By 1944, the United States would be producing more bombers than all of Germany had produced in the entire war, and Germany would find itself increasingly unable to respond to this unbeatable production. But by the time of Göring's rejection, the US war machine was already running at full throttle, and Germany was just beginning to realize the true magnitude of the failure to underestimate that production. Resistance to this reality would become one of the greatest tragedies in military history, as the war would not be won by high command strategies or brilliant tactics, but by the simple and unbeatable force of logistics and industrial production. The next few months would reveal more data, more evidence, but the Nazi leaders had already committed to denial. Rather than adaptation, they preferred to rely on the belief that their own methods were still superior. The truth was slowly being destroyed by ideology, and the consequences of this would be felt on the front lines. What the Nazi leaders refused to see would begin to become visible in a way that could no longer be ignored. And as the American production numbers piled up, Germany found itself increasingly lost, not knowing how to react to an industrial powerhouse that could no longer be surpassed. On April 23, 1943, Canaris, the head of German intelligence, was called to Hitler's bunker for a crucial meeting. He was prepared to present definitively the overwhelming evidence that American airplane production was exceeding any expectations, far more than Germany had ever imagined. In the documents that Canaris brought were Willow Run's production statistics, intercepts of spy networks, and even aerial photographs of the factory, showing the magnitude of the operation. He knew that this was the last chance to convince Hitler of the reality of industrial war. What he didn't know was that at that point, Nazi ideology had already completely overridden logic. When Canaris entered the bunker, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The command room, with its large map of occupied Europe and the front line increasingly threatened by the Allies, reflected the state of desperation that gripped the Nazi leadership. Hitler, absorbed in his own thoughts and with a ruthless expression, listened to him in silence as he laid out the figures and evidence. The Willow Run factory was producing a bomber every 63 minutes, an amount impossible to ignore. American production was dominating the skies of Europe, and Canaris believed that at last Hitler would need to admit that the war was being lost by the inability to react to that production. However, when Canaris finished presenting the reports, Hitler unhesitatingly interrupted him. "A bomber is not a car," he said, his voice cutting and full of disdain. "They don't have the soul for it." Hitler was no longer talking about numbers or machines. He was denying the very logic of modern warfare. To him, mass production such as that which was happening at Willow Run was an affront to the technical superiority which he believed was the key to victory. The geometry of the American production did not fit his worldview. The logical and mathematical reasoning that Canaris brought, confirming that the United States was surpassing Germany in airplane production, was considered impossible because it did not align with Hitler's fundamental belief in the superiority of German industry, which he believed to be unique, accurate, and inimitable. Hitler's refusal to accept the figures was more than a simple denial of the data. It was a manifestation of complete ideological collapse. Willow Run's math wasn't just being rejected for mistake or lack of information. It was being denied by a belief system that placed Germany in a position of unbeatability, not only militarily, but culturally and ideologically. The Reich, according to this view, could not be overcome by the production of a democracy. For Hitler, an American factory built with diverse labor and production methods that defied the traditional logic of war could not be considered a real threat. He refused to see the United States as a power capable of producing airplanes on such a massive and efficient scale. For him, the war should be won by precision, by technical skill, by the soul of the war machine. A bomber, according to this reasoning, could not be compared to a car, a simple consumer product built without a soul. The irony of this was profound. While Germany was stuck in its beliefs about technical and racial superiority, the truth was being built in Detroit factories on the Ford assembly lines, where workers of all races, genders, and backgrounds were creating war machines with unimaginable efficiency. The Willow Run factory, in all its magnitude and industrial simplicity, represented exactly what Hitler and his leadership refused to accept. True military strength is not based solely on the sophistication of weapons, but on the ability to produce them on a large scale and with precision. German technical supremacy was being supplanted by a model of mass production that they considered inferior, and Hitler's ideological contempt only accelerated the unfolding tragedy. What was revealed at that meeting was more than resistance to concrete data. It was confirmation that the Nazi system was already being eroded by its failure to adapt to the new reality of war. Industrial warfare was no longer a question of superior quality of machines, but of quantity and efficiency. For the United States, the war was being won not only on the front lines, but in the factories, where production was being turned into a decisive strategy. In contrast, the Nazis were so focused on an outdated model of technical and racial warfare that they could not adapt to the truth of what was happening before them. Willow Run was not just a factory, but a heresy against the Nazi racial faith. Hitler's refusal to see reality was condemning Germany to a fatal miscalculation. He was not only ignorant of the reality of numbers, he was doing this because this reality contradicted his own worldview. The United States war machine was not just a mass production of airplanes, it was a new kind of war, a war of logistics and production capacity, and the Nazis were unprepared to face it. The underestimation of American industrial capacity would become one of the greatest strategic failures of World War II, and what seemed like a simple error in judgment, the inability to accept the data, was actually an ideological flaw that could not be corrected until it was too late. This attitude of Hitler's, who rejected even the most modest figures, echoed the greatest mistake Germany could make, underestimating the enemy not by military force, but by force of production and logistics. The war would not be won only with cutting-edge armaments or brilliant strategies, but with the ability to produce day after day an overwhelming amount of resources. And the United States, with its mass production model, was becoming a war machine impossible to overcome. The lack of adaptation to the new reality of industrial warfare meant that Germany was at a strategic disadvantage that would become increasingly visible. And when, finally, the effects of this failure began to show up on the battlefields, it would be too painful a lesson for the Nazi leaders, who had already lost touch with reality. But the true extent of the disaster was yet to come. The next step would be the final confirmation that, while the Nazis were busy with their own delusions, American production was dominating the skies of Europe. In 1943, while the Nazi leadership was still refusing to accept the reality of American production, new and unforgiving evidence was about to be delivered to German intelligence. Abwehr, through discreet contacts in Switzerland, obtained something it had never imagined it had in its hands, a clandestine roll of film shot directly inside the Willow Run factory. Actual images from the assembly line showing the production of B-24 bombers at a pace that seemed to defy any industrial logic. The camera captured every detail, the tireless workers, the parts being assembled with precision, the aircraft moving forward on tracks, one after the other. Women, many of them black with hand tools, and men performing high-precision tasks, altogether creating the American war machine that the Nazis had refused to believe. Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, and his deputy Hans Oster watched the recording with growing incredulity. For the first time, the production figures that had been reported now came to life in front of them. The clock visible in the footage confirmed the production that seemed impossible. Every 63 minutes, a new aircraft was completed. The factory was not an illusion. It was not an advertisement. It was real. Oster, visibly shaken, whispered, "It's true." But the words remained in the air, not as a relief, but as the weight of a devastating revelation. They were seeing, on film, what had been discredited for so long. The truth was there before their eyes, but its implication for the future of Germany could not be ignored. However, Canaris's reaction was cold and calculated. He knew that, with the irrefutable evidence in hand, he had two options: act and report it to his superiors, or keep the film and protect himself from the accusation of defeatism. The risk of being accused of treason, or of being seen as someone who was setting the stage for a peace with the Allies, led him to make a decision. Canaris knew that, in a regime where truth could be a crime, showing these images to Berlin was almost a death sentence. He took the roll of film, which now represented the last line of defense of a Germany that refused to listen, and incinerated it in a darkened room, where the smoke of reality mingled with the silence of fear. That moment, when the truth was deliberately destroyed, marks one of the most poignant ironies in the history of World War II. The data was there, the proof was there, but Hitler's ideology and fear of admitting fault led to an act of reality destruction. The Willow Run factory, the heart of American war production, was no longer a simple number or a spy report. It was now a heresy to the belief system that ruled Germany. The massive production of airplanes, the logic of the assembly line, the use of a diverse workforce, everything that the Nazis had despised was in those images. But instead of using them to adjust strategy, Canaris and Oster were destroying the race that could save Germany, not out of ignorance, but out of the need to maintain the myth of the Reich's superiority. Canaris's reaction to what he was seeing in the film also reflects the growing internal tension in the Abwehr. He knew that as long as the evidence was being burned, the impact of this on the war would be irreversible. But more than the destruction of the film, it was burning the last chance to change the course of the war. The truth was tangibly shown, but the refusal to accept it was leading Germany to inevitable defeat. Canaris, with the decision to destroy the film, made the darkest choice: to preserve the lie that sustained the regime instead of confronting the reality that was imposed. This tension between what was true and what one wanted to believe was not just a matter of numbers. It was a battle between the unbeatable method of American production and the ideological blindness of a regime that believed its beliefs would ensure its victory, no matter the cost. The production of Willow Run and so many other American factories was creating a new form of warfare, a war in which the ability to produce faster and on a larger scale became the real key to success. And while Germany invested in sophistication and technical quality, the United States' real strength was in quantity and precision. But the question hanging over the German spies and Canaris was, how long would they be able to sustain the denial of this truth? The destruction of the film was just a symbolic moment of a mistake that was becoming more and more visible. The numbers could no longer be ignored, and soon the war itself would begin to reflect this strategic failure. While Germany destroyed the evidence of its defeat, the United States continued to produce, month after month, more aircraft, more weapons, more resources, and victory was being defined in the factories of Detroit, not on the battlefields. But the true impact of the destruction of that film would be revealed in the following months. The question was, how much more could the Nazis ignore reality, while American production dominated the skies of Europe? The consequences of this refusal to see the truth would become more and more evident. And soon, the struggle for air supremacy would begin to directly reflect this flaw in Nazi strategy. The moment of truth was approaching. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, was one of the most intellectually sophisticated figures within the Nazi regime. Unlike many of the other members of the Third Reich's leadership, Speer possessed a deep understanding of engineering and industrial production. He knew that the war would not only be decided on the battlefield, but also in the factories, on the assembly lines, and in the logistical capabilities of the nations involved. When reports on American production began to reach him, his analysis was immediate, accurate, and alarming. Speer understood the value of mass production and the impact it would have on the war. But what he read in the data about Willow Run and American factories wasn't just a warning. It was a condemnation of the inevitability of defeat. In his diaries, Speer did not hide his despair at realizing the magnitude of the United States production. He knew that American industrial capacity was surpassing anything Germany could achieve, not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of organization and efficiency. The production of B-24 bombers at Willow Run was a direct blow to Germany's war strategy. Speer wrote ruefully, "If this is true, we are facing not defeat but annihilation." These words, more than any other analysis, reflected the depth of Speer's understanding of modern warfare. He knew that it was not a question of the quantity of aircraft or armaments. The real threat was the ability of the United States to produce on such a colossal scale that no military strategy, no matter how effective, could compete. Speer's reasoning was clear. A nation that could maintain a steady and increasing pace of production not only had a strategic advantage, but had turned war into a matter of industrial resistance. Germany, with its limited production and scarce resources, was at an insurmountable disadvantage. While the United States was producing more and more, German factories, while technologically sophisticated, were facing constant bombardments and shortages of raw materials. And more importantly, Germany couldn't even compete with the amount of labor available in the United States, a diverse workforce of women, blacks, and immigrants who worked tirelessly on the production lines, producing faster and more efficiently than any German factory had ever been able to. This difference in productive culture was something that the Nazis, in their ideological belief, could not comprehend. Speer, despite his technical lucidity, was trapped in a system that still believed in the superiority of his race and the capability of his technical methods. Germany, with its ideology based on racial purity and rigid hierarchical structures, could not even conceive that an imperfect democracy was doing better than they did in terms of organization and industrial production. For Nazi leaders, American work culture, with its focus on collaboration between different social and racial groups, was deeply antithetical to what they stood for. The American workforce, rather than being seen as an asset, was seen as a threat to the ideology of Aryan supremacy, and this prejudice was preventing any adaptation to the reality of industrial warfare. Speer, however, could not deny the numbers. The data was there, clear and visible, and he knew that if these numbers were true, Germany could not win. In his analysis, he wasn't just seeing massive aircraft production, he was seeing an entire system of production that the United States had created, a system that was unbeatable. Every part of American production, from logistics to factory organization, was being coordinated in a way that made industrial warfare an immeasurable machine. For Speer, this wasn't just a miscalculation, it was the death of an ideology. The most desperate thing for Speer was that he knew he couldn't change that. Even with all his technical understanding, he was trapped in a system that couldn't admit defeat until it was too late. He knew that the only way to save Germany would be to change his approach, but that would mean going against the regime's own ideology. American production was not just a military threat, it was a demonstration that the future of warfare would not be decided solely by technical talent, but by the ability to sustain mass, coordinated production. Speer, with all his technical ability, was powerless in the face of this reality. This impotence was reflected in his constant struggle to convince Hitler and the High Command to adopt a more rational and production-focused approach. Speer knew that the numbers he had in his hands were beginning to expose a flaw in the heart of German strategy. The war was not being won with more sophisticated weapons or brilliant tactics, but with the ability to do more, faster, and more efficiently. And while the United States was succeeding in doing so, Germany was clinging to an old-fashioned mindset, believing that technical superiority and military strength were the only keys to victory. This conflict between what was technically necessary to win the war and what the Nazi regime was willing to accept became increasingly evident. Speer's lucidity was not enough to change the course of events, as his refusal to abandon the regime's core beliefs prevented any significant change. Germany was facing a battle on two fronts, one on the battlefield and one in industrial production, and in the production war, Germany was clearly losing. Speer's numbers, while accurate and profound, began to become a weight he could no longer carry. His understanding that Germany was facing industrial annihilation was a moment of rare clarity within the regime, but this understanding was not enough to avert catastrophe. Speer's words, "If this is true, we are facing not defeat but annihilation," would echo as a warning that would be ignored until the effects of this failure were irremediable. As American production continued to grow, Germany found itself under increasing pressure, and victory in the US factories was about to be reflected much more visibly on the front lines. The production, which the Nazis refused to accept, was beginning to become a dominant presence on the war scene, and as Germany continued to struggle with reality, the United States was preparing to launch the largest industrial offensive in the history of the war. The impact of this massive production was yet to be fully revealed. How would irrefutable production figures become the final blow to German strategy? The answer was about to be given in a concrete and devastating way. In April 1945, the last days of the Third Reich were being defined not by armies, but by the imminent destruction of an empire that had clung to lies and ideology until the last moment. In Berlin, in the heart of the devastation, German intelligence officers were finishing what would become the latest report on American industrial production, specifically on the Willow Run assembly line. That report was the final piece of a story that had been ignored and distorted for more than 3 years. In it were all the data that Canaris, Speer, and others had ever feared. The figures were clear. The American production was not only real, but it was exceeding any expectations. Willow Run alone had achieved an unsustainable pace, a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. However, the impact of this report was nil. Hitler was already in the bunker, trapped in his beliefs, in his world of illusions, where reality could no longer penetrate. Germany lay in ruins, and as the Allied forces advanced and the cities of the Reich were devastated by bombing, the report on Willow Run was simply set aside, buried under a mountain of useless military reports and documents lost in the chaos of war. The truth once again was ignored. The American war machine, which the German spies had monitored, which Canaris and Oster had tried to warn Berlin, was about to liquidate any chance of final resistance. American production had already surpassed Germany in absolute numbers. By 1944, production of B-24 bombers was 18,000 units, a number that made German efforts seem like an insignificant fraction, and the Germans still refused to accept this, with Nazi leaders such as Göring and Hitler insisting that it was not possible that the Americans were producing so quickly. The math did not fit what they believed was possible. But the reality was simple. The United States was creating more aircraft than Germany's entire aircraft industry could produce in years. Shocking data, isn't it? Comment below with absolute power or logistics wins if this statistic surprised you. The truth once again was before them, But ideological blindness prevented any rational action. What followed was a tragedy of ego and ideology. The report, written with technical precision, confirmed not only the scale of production but the diversity of the workforce that Germany could never have imagined. Women, African Americans, immigrants, all working with the same efficiency and precision as any European worker, but with a capacity for mobilization and organization that the Reich could never replicate. And production did not stop. As the Soviet army approached Berlin and Allied forces advanced in the West, the U.S. industrial machine had already outstripped all German capabilities. The report was clear. If the war was decided by the ability to produce, the United States had already won. But the war would not be decided by numbers alone. Germany, with all its technology and with its elite armies, still believed that victory could be won with a combination of tactics and precision weapons. And deep in the bunker, Hitler still believed that his vision of war, based on a racial and technical elite, would prevail. He still believed that his technical superiority was enough to stand up to American mass production. He didn't want to hear what the numbers were saying, and the German war machine was already broken before it could even adapt to the new reality. While the report on Willow Run was lost among the wreckage of war, American production continued to flood the skies over Europe. B-24 bombers, like well-tuned clocks, flew over the front lines, bombed German factories and cities, turning victory into a matter of industrial inevitability. But the Germans continued to deceive themselves, believing in an impossible victory, blinded by the ideology that had kept them at war for so long. The empire they built did not collapse due to lack of data, but due to the inability to hear the truth, even when it was right before their eyes. And by the time the truth finally reached Berlin, it was too late. The fall of Berlin would not only be a military defeat, it would be the fall of a system that had closed itself to any form of adaptation. The last report, buried under the rubble of the burning city, would never reach Hitler's bunker. The Nazi system collapsed, not because of a lack of information, but because of its refusal to accept the real world. Germany was on the verge of losing the war, not because of a lack of technical competence, but because of its inability to adapt to the new era of industrial warfare. The lesson would be clear. History would not be written only by the winners, but by the ability to understand and master the resources needed to win. The fall of Berlin was approaching, but the Nazis had already lost long before Soviet tanks entered the city. The last battle would not be fought on the battlefields, but in the factories that the Germans had ignored until the last moment. The production, the real battlefield of World War II, was decided in Detroit, not Berlin. And while Willow Run's report was never delivered, the industrial reality it represented would become the real reason Germany would lose the war. And now the last piece of this puzzle would reveal itself in the final days of the war, when the impact of the refusal to see the truth would manifest itself dramatically and definitively. In February 1944, Germany's skies were filled with an unprecedented number of bombers. Operation Argument, which marked a crucial turning point in World War II, was not just an air offensive but the culmination of an industrial conflict. More than 1,000 American heavy bombers, all produced on an unbeatable assembly line, crossed the sky to German factories. They weren't just attacking strategic points, they were making a direct assault on the heart of the Reich's war production. In 6 days, the United States dropped more tons of bombs than the entire Luftwaffe had dropped during the Blitz on London. The big difference now was that airplane production no longer came just from a supremacist ideology or sophisticated military engineering, but from an industrial capability that could no longer be ignored, a capability that the Nazis had repeatedly underestimated. The impact of this offensive was immediate and devastating. Germany's aircraft factories, already overstretched and vulnerable, were bombed at a relentless pace. Ford, Boeing, Douglas, and other American manufacturers now dumped the weight of industrialization directly into enemy territory, causing irreparable damage to German facilities. For the Reich High Command, this was more than a simple military defeat. It was the destruction of their belief that they could win the war with sophisticated technology, strategy, and willpower. What the United States was doing was not just producing more aircraft, but producing with such efficiency that it exceeded any expectations. What seemed to be a fantasy, the uninterrupted mass production of war machines, was becoming a terrifying reality for Germany. During these raids, pilot Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's greatest aces, observed the formation of American bombers with an incredulous gaze. "I saw 800 bombers. They are real," Galland told Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, in a conversation that reflected the shock of reality against the denial that had dominated the Reich for so long. Galland, accustomed to taking on Allied planes, was now witnessing the true magnitude of American production, and it was a hard blow. It wasn't just a few bombers. It wasn't just inflated numbers or spy information. What Galland was seeing was the American war machine in action, and it was impossible to ignore that mass production, which he and his colleagues had dismissed as a propaganda gimmick, was real and overwhelming. The fact that the United States had surpassed Germany in terms of aircraft production was already evident to anyone watching. But Operation Argument was the defining moment, the point at which data turned into tangible destruction. Germany, which had depended on its technical sophistication and the precision of its designs, was now facing the immensity of what it meant to produce more, faster, and more constantly. As the Luftwaffe desperately tried to muster its scarce resources, American bombers continued to fall from the sky, unleashing mass destruction on the weapons and aircraft factories that had been the backbone of the Reich's military strength. In response to the attack, Göring tried to downplay the seriousness of the situation, but could no longer hide the evidence that the Reich was losing the industrial war. Germany had been defeated on the battlefield of production, and the Reichsmarschall knew it, even if it didn't want to admit it. The relentless bombing of more than 1,000 American planes not only caused material destruction, but dismantled the arrogance that had been the bedrock of Nazi military strategy. For the regime, which believed that the war would be won by technical superiority and the strength of a small number of sophisticated weapons, the numbers were now irrefutable. The United States was defeating Germany not by the force of its guns, but by the strength of its industrial production. And with each bomber launched, the myth of Nazi superiority disintegrated. Unbelievable, isn't it? If you were surprised by this statistic, comment below with logistics wins or absolute power to share your reaction to this stunning reality. The numbers don't lie, and the truth was finally being revealed in the sky over Germany, which was now being filled by planes manufactured at a rate the Nazis could never achieve. War, until then, had been understood as a conflict of superior tactics and technologies. However, the February 1944 attack showed that modern warfare was being won by whoever was able to produce the most at an impressive speed. The American war machine, built on an unparalleled industrial base, was crushing German defenses. And while Germany's factories were in ruins, American factories continued to produce non-stop, pouring more and more resources into fueling the war. What seemed like an unattainable victory, an almost mythical industrial power, now materialized as a real nightmare for the Reich. The denial of American industrial reality, which had permeated the Nazi high command for so long, finally began to crumble. But by then, Hitler's regime was already in decline. The Nazi war machine, so focused on its own ideology, was losing the ability to adapt. American production was out of reach, and the war was being defined by the pace of production rather than the technical accuracy of weapons. By the time Operation Argument ended, Germany had not only suffered a military coup, but also a cultural and strategic defeat, which symbolized the collapse of belief in the Reich. As losses began to pile up and the United States continued to bomb German factories, doubt about the viability of a Reich victory became untenable. For German leaders, the battle for air supremacy, which they had long lost, now seemed lost in the field of production as well. And at the moment when reality became impossible to deny, the regime was still stuck with an ideology that prevented it from changing. But the worst was yet to come. The struggle for air superiority would not end only with the destruction of the factories. It would extend to the front lines, where American production would begin to set the pace of battle in a way the Nazis could never have imagined. And the impact of this would become brutally evident in the next offensives. The real battle for industrial warfare was about to unfold in an even more devastating way. Hans Gisevius, an Abwehr officer, was aware of the unfolding tragedy. In his memoirs, he wrote, "We have not lacked intelligence about American production. We drown in it." This phrase encapsulates the fundamental flaw of the Third Reich. It was not the lack of information, but the inability to interpret it correctly that was leading Germany to defeat. For years, German intelligence had collected data, intercepts, and testimonies confirming the magnitude of US industrial production, especially at factories like Willow Run. They knew of the American ability to produce B-24 bombers at a rate that was impossible to match. They also knew that the factories were operating at full speed, with a diversity of labor and logistical coordination that challenged any traditional industrial logic. But despite all the evidence, the Nazis refused to believe the reality that was being presented to them. The issue was not data collection. The Abwehr had access to detailed information captured from reliable sources, including spies, diplomats, and even aerial imagery. The problem lay in the interpretation of this information, or more precisely, in the refusal to accept it. Nazi leaders, dominated by an ideology that extolled technical, racial, and cultural superiority, simply could not conceive that the true strength of a nation at war lay in its ability to mass produce. The belief in a military victory based on precision weapons, in battles of ingenuity and brute force, prevented them from understanding that the future of war was being decided in factories, where the United States produced more aircraft, more armaments, and more resources than Germany could dream of producing. The idea that victory could be guaranteed by the production was a reality that Nazi leaders could not accept. The mathematics of American production, millions of parts, millions of workers, millions of square feet of incessantly running factories, did not fit the Nazi worldview. Göring and Hitler's refusal to believe what the numbers were saying was largely a consequence of their ideological outlook. They did not want to accept that a democracy, with a diverse workforce and based on principles of individual liberty, could be more effective than the rigid state control and hierarchy of a dictatorship. For the Nazis, the war was to be won by racial superiority and the purity of the war machines. The fact that the United States was winning the war with a combination of mass production and logistical innovation was a direct affront to the dogma that governed the Third Reich. The irony of this refusal to accept the truth was overwhelming. American factories were producing planes at such an impressive rate that if the data had been accepted, Germany would have been forced to reassess its strategy. But instead, the Nazis clung to the belief that technical superiority and precision weapons such as the V-2 rocket would be enough to ensure victory. They didn't see what was going on around them. While the United States created airplanes like clockwork, with precision and regularity, Germany was sinking into the scarcity of resources and the inefficiency of its factories, which were being destroyed by Allied air raids. What the German spies had so clearly revealed was not only ignored, but was discredited by the Reich leadership, which could not see the true nature of the threat. Gisevius, in reflecting on this fatal error, noted how Germany not only failed to perceive reality, but how it drowned in the abundance of data. In his mind, the great tragedy was not the lack of information, but the fact that this data was available, was proven, and yet was ignored. Germany was not defeated by a failure of intelligence, but by a failure to accept reality when it was clear and before them. The Nazi regime not only ignored the truth, but it did so out of conviction, pride, and the ideological blindness that dominated its worldview. This denial was not only a failure of interpretation, but a moral and political failure. The refusal to accept the superiority of American production was not just a matter of technical error, but a matter of pride and ideology. Germany did not want to believe that the United States was creating an unbeatable industrial force. They did not want to believe that a democracy could overcome a totalitarian regime, that a nation with a diverse work structure could overcome the war machine of a superior nation like Germany. Racial pride, which permeated the entire structure of the Nazi regime, made this acceptance impossible. While the truth was being ignored, industrial warfare was being won on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States production was not just a matter of numbers. It was a dynamic and unbeatable force, which fed a war machine that could not be stopped. B-24 bombers and other planes were being produced on such a large scale that even with the best efforts of the Luftwaffe, Germany had no way to compete. Germany's technical superiority was being surpassed by the quantity and efficiency of American production, and the data that the German spies had on this was complete, but it was ignored, buried under the weight of ideology. How could a nation so obsessed with racial purity and technical superiority fail to realize the true nature of modern warfare? How could the Nazis, with all their belief in their own invincibility, allow themselves to be outclassed in a field they considered inferior? The answer lay in the ideological blindness that permeated the regime. The war would not be won by military force alone, or the most sophisticated weapons, but by the ability to sustain an incessant production of resources, weapons, and technology. And that lesson was ignored by the Nazis until it was too late. In the last days of the war, when the Allies were about to invade Berlin, Germany was surrounded from all directions. Factories were being destroyed, and American production figures were clearer than ever. However, Germany continued to cling to a system that prevented it from adapting. The refusal to listen, to understand, to accept the truth was not just a failure to interpret the data. It was an existential failure, a failure that led to annihilation. And the question that remained was, how long could Germany continue to ignore reality while the Allies advanced and American production dominated the skies and seas? The answer was about to be given, but not without devastating consequences. Willow Run, located in Detroit, was more than just a factory. It was an industrial monster, a stunning example of how the mass mobilization of resources, people, and machines could generate unbeatable force. When the Americans began expanding their war production in 1941, they weren't just creating airplanes, they were creating a logistical and human structure that worked in perfect harmony, like a living organism. This was not just a factory, it was the reflection of a nation's industrial capacity when it dedicated itself to using all its productive forces in a common cause. The Willow Run plant, built by Ford, was designed to be the largest aircraft assembly plant in the world and quickly became the beating heart of U.S. military production. The production of B-24 Liberator bombers at Willow Run was on a scale that not only impressed, but also redefined what was possible in terms of mass manufacturing. The factory had an area of 3.5 million square feet, the equivalent of 85 football fields. Each part of the assembly line was meticulously organized, with parts and components converging at exact points along its journey. The complexity of the process was immense, but the execution was perfect. On each shift, some 42,000 workers worked tirelessly to ensure that production did not stop. From a logistical point of view, the factory functioned as a human and mechanical ecosystem, where each part, from workers to machines, had a specific and crucial role for the success of the operation. Every worker at Willow Run was not just a worker on an assembly line, it was an essential part of a coordinated system. On average, every 63 minutes, an 18-ton bomber was completed, and this did not happen by accident. Every second was valuable, and the pace of production was relentless. The factory was divided into highly specialized work areas, where workers dedicated to a single task, such as installing hydraulic systems, assembling the wings, or assembling the engines, repeated their function with precision. These tasks were so well defined that workers could be trained and put into operation in an extremely short period of time, allowing shifts to rotate without loss of productivity. The number of operations carried out simultaneously was impressive. Imagine thousands of different airplane parts from various sections of the B-24 converging on an assembly line. The fuselages came from one side, the wings from the other, the engines from another distant point. As parts arrived, assembly progressed in a coordinated and synchronized fashion, with workers performing repetitive but critical tasks, each performing their part to ensure the aircraft was ready on time. The ability to manage this immense amount of simultaneous operations, all precisely coordinated, was a feat of logistics engineering that no German factory could even dream of replicating. But it wasn't just the production capacity that made Willow Run so impressive. The factory also stood out for the diversity and organization of its workforce. In a country marked by deep social inequalities, Willow Run became a space where everyone was needed, regardless of race, gender, or origin. More than 40% of the workforce were women, many of whom had never worked on an assembly line before the war. Black women, who faced discrimination in other parts of the country, also found work in the factory, performing tasks that required extreme skill and precision. The idea that the United States, an open democracy, could utilize all of its productive forces so efficiently was a concept impossible for the Nazis to accept. They believed that only an organized and controlled nation could achieve such a level of efficiency, but the United States proved that the real strength came from mobilizing the talent of the entire population. The logistics of supplies at Willow Run was another notable feat. Parts arrived from all over the country, engines from Michigan, airframes from New York, electrical components from Chicago. Every part of the process, from the production of the parts to their arrival on the assembly line, was interconnected in a way that maximized efficiency and minimized delays. Internal transportation in the factory was also an impressive operation. Tracks, and automated vehicles moved incessantly to ensure that the right parts were in the right place at the right time. The management of this supply chain, involving tens of thousands of workers and thousands of tons of materials, was an example of how logistics could be organized on a monumental scale. And it was thus, with this precision, that the industrial production of the United States transformed the war. Through Willow Run, the United States wasn't just creating weapons. It was creating a new way of waging war, a war that depended not just on military strength, but on the ability to maintain constant production, to ensure that every part needed to power the war machine was always available. The Nazis, in their belief in technical and elite warfare, could not comprehend how such a diverse workforce and such an imperfect industrial organization could overcome their highly controlled system. As the weeks passed and production on Willow Run continued, the impact of this on the European battlefronts became evident. B-24 bombers, now in large numbers, began to take to the skies, taking the attacks on Germany's production centers and supply lines. What seemed impossible, an industrial army formed by a democracy, was becoming an unstoppable force. The war, which for so long had been decided on the battlefield by force of will and sophisticated tactics, was now being decided on the assembly line. The irony of this story is that the solution was before them all along. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the history of Willow Run and the impact of American production on World War II. But as American bombers began to mark the end of Germany's air supremacy, the question was, how long could Germany continue to ignore the devastating impact of this production? The answer was about to be revealed, and the real battle for industrial victory would begin to be reflected on an even larger scale. The war would no longer be decided in the trenches or on the battlefield, but in the skies of Europe, where the effects of American production would prove more devastating than any weapon could ever be. The next chapter of this story would begin to reveal how, even in the last days of the Reich, American production continued to seal its fate. In the heart of World War II, as the Nazis steadfastly followed their belief in racial purity and the superiority of their nation, a feat that would challenge that ideology was in full swing at the Willow Run plant. There, in Ford's gigantic hangars, more than 42,000 workers were churning out B-24 bombers at a rate impossible to be achieved by any other belligerent nation. But the real irony was in the composition of this workforce. Contrary to the Nazi vision of a strong people made up of a pure race, Willow Run stood out for diversity, which the Nazis considered a weakness. It was a mix of women, blacks, immigrants, and even people with disabilities, a diversity that would become the real force behind the American victory. More than 11,000 women worked on the assembly line, a staggering number, especially at a time when women's work was seen as secondary and often limited to clerical or domestic duties. These women, however, were central pieces in the war effort. Not only did they perform simple tasks, but they were directly involved in complex processes of assembling and operating machine tools, accurately performing work that was previously exclusive to men. Women were trained to do whatever was necessary, from installing hydraulic systems to assembling crucial parts inside the bomber. The idea that a country could win a war with a workforce made up largely of women was an unthinkable idea for Nazi leaders who were so fixated on their gender ideology that they saw women only as subordinate figures. At Willow Run, though, women proved to be an indispensable and vital part of the war machine. In addition, more than 3,800 African Americans, a population often discriminated against and marginalized, were present at Willow Run, working alongside whites, immigrants, and people with disabilities, performing complex assembly and fabrication tasks. For the Nazis, the concept of an inferior race people was a central pillar of their worldview. They saw black populations as incapable of contributing meaningfully to any war effort, let alone such a grandiose industrial feat. However, African Americans at Willow Run were performing highly technical work, operating machine tools with precision, assembling vital parts of airplanes with the same skill and dedication as any other worker. His presence at Willow Run, in contrast to the racial prejudice of the Nazis, was a true affront to the myth of racial purity that underpinned Nazi ideology. What the Reich considered a burden in reality became the basis of its defeat. The ability of the United States to integrate all social and ethnic groups into industrial production was one of the greatest forces that the Reich underestimated. For the Nazis, the idea of a strong and victorious nation built on diversity of race, gender, and physical condition was inconceivable. They believed that a nation's strength lay in its homogeneity, that racial purity was the only path to supremacy. But in Willow Run, that idea was brutally dismantled, and America's true strength was revealed, the sum of its differences. It was not exclusion or segregation that ensured American victory, but inclusion and the ability to mobilize all available human potential, regardless of origin. The work of men with physical disabilities was also part of this revolution. At a time when people with disabilities were often pushed out of the workforce, American factories, especially Willow Run, made a conscious effort to employ these people by offering them roles that were suited to their abilities. This was not seen as a charitable grant, but as a practical necessity. On the assembly line, the work of a person with a disability was as valuable as that of any other worker, contributing to the overall performance of the factory and the relentless pace of production. This approach, which embraced human and physical diversity, was one of the keys to Willow Run's success. Meanwhile, Germany, with all its pretense of racial and technical superiority, was beginning to see the effects of its policy of exclusion. They believed that their war machine would work because it was made up of pure and superior elements, but they were wrong. It was not just military technique, but the ability of a society to unite all its talents and efforts for a common goal that would determine the winner. Germany, with its rigid and segregationist system, was fighting a war on a battlefield where flexibility and the mobilization of all available human resources would be the greatest advantages. The real lesson of this part of history is not just about the industrial superiority of the United States, but about the value of inclusion. The work at Willow Run, fueled by a diverse workforce, proved that a nation's true strength lies not in the purity of its population, but in the ability to unite its talents, skills, and potential, no matter where they come from. For the Nazis, this concept was unthinkable. For the Americans, it was the key to victory. The irony of this story cannot be ignored. Germany, which saw itself as a nation destined for supremacy, was defeated not by the superiority of the military force of its enemies, but by the ability of the United States to mobilize and integrate all its people, regardless of race, gender, or condition. The victory of the United States was not a victory of arms, but a victory of productive force, fueled by an ideology of inclusion, where the value of each individual was recognized and used for the common good. As the war drew to a close, the real reason why Germany was losing began to become clearer. And as American bombers continued to devastate Germany's armaments factories, the question was, how long would the Nazis continue to ignore the most fundamental lesson of all? The answer was about to be revealed, and it would begin to unfold on the battlefields, where American production would finally destroy the Reich's last line of defense. Decades after the end of World War II, the scene of reconciliation between the former enemies would become a place where the myths and ideologies that had shaped the bloodiest conflicts in history would finally be put to the test. One day in 1985, at the Yankee Air Museum in Michigan, Hans Rudel, a former Luftwaffe pilot, and Rosa Munro, one of the famous Rosies who worked on the assembly lines during the war, met. Rudel, who had been one of Germany's highest fighter pilots, a man who had seen and destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Luftwaffe pilot, was now faced with a woman who represented everything his military ideology had despised. He approached her, with a gaze that bore the weight of years of conflict, and asked a question that, at this point, reflected the profound irony of the industrial war that had defined the fate of the two countries. "How did the Americans manage to build so many planes so fast?" asked Rudel, his voice heavy with the incredulity he still felt, even after so many years. For him, the answer lay in something he could never have imagined: mass production, a diverse workforce, and the incessant work of women in factories. To Germany, this reality seemed an impossibility, an absurdity, something that its ideology could never have accepted. Yet there stood before him the very embodiment of the war machine that he, a soldier, had fought during the war. Rosa Munro, an ordinary woman, without titles, without special heroism, looked at him with a simple smile and said, "We just went to work every day." That answer, without ostentation, without mystery, without glory, summed up everything the Nazis could not see. They were so focused on the idea of an ideological struggle between races and the superiority of their war machine that they never imagined that Americans, with their factories, women, blacks, immigrants, and even people with disabilities, would defeat the empire they believed was unbeatable. The real power, the real strength, lay in the ability of democracy to mobilize all its human resources without discrimination, without restrictions, to create something that no ideology of racial supremacy could reproduce. Rudel was silent at the simplicity of the answer. The man who had spent his life believing that war was won by willpower and racial purity could not believe what he had heard. He who had flown sophisticated fighter jets, bombed targets with precision, was now faced with the truth. Victory came not only from technical superiority, but from the ability to work together, to integrate all the elements of a society to achieve a common goal. He, as an elite Luftwaffe pilot, had been part of a machine that believed in its own power and its invincibility, but here was the real victory. A woman, an ordinary worker, saying that all it took was to go to work every day. This moment, apparently simple, carried with it an immense load of meaning. Rudel, with all his experience, and Rosa, with her silent dedication, symbolized the confrontation between the two ideologies that had faced each other in the war. The arrogance of racial purity and the belief in Germany's military superiority were eventually overcome by the humility of American democracy, where the strength lay in the sum of differences and the ability to unite all people for a common effort. The empire that considered itself superior was defeated not by military force, but by the immense industrial capacity of a democratic nation that did not exclude, but included all its citizens. The struggle for freedom and justice does not take place only in battles, but in the ability of a nation to work together, respecting differences and becoming stronger precisely because of this. This meeting between Rudel and Monroe decades later was not just a reunion of former enemies, but a symbolic moment in which the ideological war came to an end. When Rudel looked at her in silence, he was not only acknowledging the strength of an ordinary woman, but the defeat of the empire he had served, the defeat of an ideology that preached exclusion and purity, and the rise of a nation that built its strength on inclusion and cooperation. Rosa Monroe, who had been a simple worker on the assembly lines, had unwittingly overturned the myths of an empire, not with weapons, not with great heroic deeds, but with daily work, with the dedication of thousands of women like her, who contributed to the war effort with the same diligence and precision as any pilot or soldier. And when she said those simple words, she was summing up a truth greater than any bomb or fighter plane could offer. The true strength of a people lies in the sum of its differences, not in the exclusion of them. Understanding this, Rudel himself bowed silently to the force of this truth. The end of the war brought with it the defeat of an empire, but also the victory of a more powerful concept, the power of diversity, inclusion, and collective strength. But while Germany was about to surrender, the impact of that lesson was yet to come. The next chapter of history would begin to show how the scars of war would continue to shape Europe and the post-war world, and how the real struggle for peace lay not just in the rebuilding of nations, but in accepting the lesson left by the workers of Willow Run. What followed would be a journey of moral reconstruction, in which even the victors themselves would need to confront the legacy of the war and the choices they had made. The story of Willow Run is, above all, a story of how reality can prove to be more powerful than the most imposing ideologies. At its core, what happened in Detroit in the 1940s was not just a military or industrial victory. It was the demonstration of a fundamental truth. Ideologies fail when they refuse to deal with reality, and societies that ignore the diversity of their own talents are ultimately doomed to failure. Germany, with its belief in the supremacy of a race and the purity of its war machine, could not see what was happening before its eyes. They believed that the strength of an empire lay in its homogeneous culture, and military strength concentrated in the hands of an elite. But the United States, with its inclusive production system, which integrated women, blacks, immigrants, and people with disabilities, proved that the true strength of a nation comes from its ability to mobilize all its human resources. Willow Run as an assembly line was not just a feat of engineering, it was a reflection of the power of democracy in action, where each individual, regardless of their background, contributed to a common effort. This is what the Nazis never managed to understand. The true power of a nation lies not in excluding, but in including. This principle is not just a historical lesson, but a universal lesson about politics, faith, truth, and power. Today, we are at a time where new forms of arrogance, moral blindness, and exclusion are beginning to dominate many parts of the world. How many Willow Runs are we ignoring right now, under the weight of our own ideologies and prejudices? How many opportunities for progress, innovation, and unity are being wasted because we still prefer to believe in myths of purity instead of accepting the truth of collective value? In an increasingly complex and interconnected world, the true strength of societies will come when everyone has their place and their voice, when we are able to mobilize not only the strongest, but all those who have something to offer. The question that arises now is, are we ready to learn the lessons that history offers us, or will we continue to ignore them until it is too late? And with that, what's to come may be even more telling about how today's global challenges are in many ways the continuation of that struggle for truth, justice, and strength that has for so long been underestimated. The story of Willow Run and the defeat of the Third Reich ends definitively with the realization of the ideological and military collapse of Germany. Industrial war, like a monster of production and logistics, crushed the resistance of the Reich, which, blinded by its belief in an unbeatable empire, failed to grasp the true strength of the United States, the ability to generate relentless mass production, fueled by a democratic system that united all its human resources. The defeat did not only happen on the battlefield, but in factories and on assembly lines, where numbers spoke louder than any military strategy. The Third Reich, with its obsession with racial purity and technical superiority, was brought down not only by fighting forces, but by the inexorable reality that the industrial strength of the United States, with its diversity and ability to produce non-stop, turned the war into a game where volume and logistics dominated tactics and technique. The great lesson this story offers us is universal and timeless. Logistics determine strategy, and mass production capacity can outperform even the most sophisticated military tactics. Engineering can win when it's fueled by a clear and inclusive purpose. It was not the excellence in weapons or the precision of the military forces that ensured the victory of the United States, but the ability of its democracy to mobilize all its citizens, without distinction, to create an unstoppable war machine. Germany, by focusing on exclusion and purity, ignored the power of inclusion and unity, a failure that led to its downfall. In times of war, superiority lies not only in willpower or technical skill, but in the ability to maintain an incessant and well-coordinated production that sustains the entire fighting machine. The impact of this ideological tragedy was summed up by a high-ranking Luftwaffe officer who, reflecting on the defeat, said bitterly, "We were defeated by trucks." This simple phrase encapsulates the brutal irony of how Germany, a nation that saw itself as superior, was overcome by a model of production that they considered inferior and by the inclusion of all elements of society in the war effort. The victory was one of continuous and coordinated work, not of exclusive sophistication. If you are impressed by the data and revelations of this story, enjoy this video and subscribe to the channel to support the research and search for historical truth. Comment below on the most shocking data you have discovered, and don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that we will bring you. The story we have just told shows us the importance of understanding the impact of often underestimated factors on global conflicts, and the next video will bring an equally impactful story. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.